So first I just want to say thanks to NIMBioS for hosting us, and John, who deserves definitely the lion's share of the credit for organizing and all of that, and then all of you for being here. So this term information transport is not well defined, I would say. I'm going to try and sell you on two different versions of it in this talk. The first part is going to be just trying to get at the idea of what is self-replication, and then we'll make it more precise mathematically as we go. So I just want to start with a few motivating quotes. During this conference so far, we've talked a lot about evolution and information theory and statistical inference. And a lot of people have a feeling that these things are related, and many people have beliefs on how they're related. And I think there's some interesting common quotes here, both from the evolutionary side and then also famous quotes from statisticians and geneticists. They all sort of seem to believe that either evolution or inference or information theory is the only real way that anything learns. So I think it's interesting that a lot of people from what initially appear to be different fields have converged on a common set of ideas. So the first thing I want to do is talk about what an evolutionary process is. And I'm going to start with this idea by Richard Dawkins called universal Darwinism. So he was trying to describe the necessary ingredients for an evolutionary process. And so you need some kind of self-replicating entity, and its progeny have to somehow inherit the traits that it has. And then you have to have some sort of variation in this process. So the traits have to give rise to new variants, and then those new variants have to somehow be selected. Some of them have to proliferate more than the others. And so to him, these were the key ingredients for a process that we might consider to be evolutionary. Right? And then there's other people that have come across very similar collections of ideas, even before Richard Dawkins. So there's Donald Campbell has this idea of blind variation and selective retention, which is essentially the same three rules. And then there's been others as well. So we want to get from this idea down to something like the replicator equation that we can study mathematically. So what's this idea of replication, right? So very vaguely we might say it's some pattern that proliferates somehow. So, you know, when you call something a replicator, there's lots of things that we think about as replicating entities, obviously biological organisms, cells. Some components of cells are themselves independently self-replicating. And there's been a lot of recent discussion in the literature about interpreting cells as players in evolutionary game theory, as cooperators and defectors in cancer models, for instance. Right, and then we can think of molecular replicators. So, you know, Richard Dawkins had this idea of the selfish gene, that it was a replicator. We've these transposons, these units that jump around, DNA, bacteria, plasmids independently replicating and spreading circular bits of DNA. There's these self-replicating RNA strands, and so there's a few famous ones, this Spiegelman's monster, where he took a self-replicating RNA strand and he put it in a beaker and he let it replicate a bunch of times, and he sampled it and he put it in another beaker and he sampled it and he put it in another beaker, and he did this many, many generations. And at the end of this process, it was nothing but the binding site for RNA replicase. So the rest of it had cut away. And it was because the smallest one, in that case, replicated the fastest. And there's lots of examples in the biological world. There's viruses, there's RNA viruses, which are little more sometimes than naked RNA strands that are sucked up by plants and proliferated. A virus could be an RNA or DNA. It has a protein shell around it. Right, and there's even self-replicating proteins that are known to cause things like mad cow disease. And so depending on where you look in the literature, people will either consider these things self-replicating or not. But I think the push recently is towards considering all these things as replicating entities in their own right. And then, so Richard Dawkins had this idea of universal Darwinism because he wanted to go beyond biology and to think of cultural elements as replicators as well. And lots of people have written about this, and recently there's been more academic work on these ideas. But basically, he coined this term the meme, which is some sort of unit of information that transmits from person to person. Might be an idea, a behavior, a fashion style, might be types of words or songs or phrases or the alphabet. Even things like proverbs, you could think of this. So you've probably heard this proverb before: people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Supposedly this goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, but yet it's proliferated throughout different languages and different variations over time. And then language itself. So, you know, if you're not used to thinking about it this way, I just want to show you some recent work that other people have done that is applying evolutionary techniques to studying these kinds of things. So this is a linguist tree of languages. I apologize for the small type, but it starts with this theoretical Indo-European language, and it branches out to, so this is derived from comparative linguistics. Linguists compare two languages, and they look at the way that the sounds are proliferated over time, and you can make this tree structure where you have, say, Germanic languages and ones that have come out from that, and then you have some of these little ones that are isolated in on their own. Well, you can do something neat where you take a common corpus of 200 words that are very basic and common to all languages. Words for like sleep or sit or mother, things that you would expect to find in any culture, and you can treat those like they're your genes of the language and break them down into their base phonemes, the different sounds that make them up. And you can then apply a phylogenetic algorithm to this DNA of your languages, right? And what you get is a tree of languages, and even though it's laid out differently, if you look at the branching points of this one, it's almost identical to the ones that linguists have come up with. So you've got the Germanic languages over here that I pointed out. You've got some of these language here that's on their own. And it's almost identical to the previous slide. So I think it's useful I think this analogy is more than just wishful thinking. I think it's turned out to be pretty useful in a lot of contexts. Okay, and then so there's like ordinary everyday replicators that we all know, right? So stop, drop, and roll. If you're on fire, you stop, drop, and roll, right? Right? I mean, we all know this, right? Because it's advantageous to know this, and so we teach it to our children. It spreads because it's useful. And then there's newly emerging ones, computer viruses. So the newest computer viruses have they mutate themselves to avoid detection by virus programs. So they've started a back and forth process of evolution. Then of course, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, you can think of this idea of memes itself as a meme that I'm trying to spread to you right now, and so you can kind of get self-referential with that. So we could spend all day talking about that, but anyway, so I'm just going to take a very general view of what a replicator is, right? It's just something that replicates. I'm not going to be concerned with how it stores its own internal information, just by the way it behaves. Okay, so I want to cast this in the language of information theory. And again, we've heard information in several different ways, and there's this nice quote from von Neumann to Shannon. And he basically told Shannon, after he came up with his entropy function, he didn't have a good name for it yet. And von Neumann told him to call it entropy. One, because von Neumann knew in statistical mechanics that a similar function had been used. But two, he says that since no one really knows what entropy is, when you're debating this, you'll always have an advantage. And so we've already, to this day, this is at least 50 years ago, and we've already had several disagreements over what is entropy, what is information. So I'm going to stick to the information theoretic definitions. Okay, so this is something we've talked about before. So Shannon was interested in communication theory, and there's this idea of communicating information through a noisy channel. And so what I want to propose is that replication is essentially transmitting information through a noisy channel. And so there's lots of instances in biology where people have already taken this approach. So this is a kind of a loose diagram of translating DNA into a protein by translating to messenger RNA, and it's pointing out all the sources of noise in that process during translation or transcription. And so if we want to think of DNA as a replicator that goes through a noisy channel, right, we just have, instead of thinking of transcription to proteins, just think of the process of DNA replication, where we start with one molecule. Our channel is whatever the cellular medium that we use to produce another DNA molecule, and then there's noise due to all kinds of things, thermodynamic noise, and there being other molecules around that are bumping into it and what have you. So I want to think of a replicator as something I push through a noisy channel, and then its progeny get pushed through a noisy channel, and then everybody gets pushed through noisy channels, right? And since these channels are noisy, that's necessarily introducing some variation into my replication process, right? It's not that I need even to say that I think that is an unnecessary axiom, I guess is what I'm saying, of universal Darwinism, right? All channels are noisy, so there's going to be variation when you put information through channels. Right, so accordingly, if we have any evolutionary process where we have some kind of replication going on, we should expect that there would be natural sources of variation. Right, so we can take universal Darwinism and we can call replication maybe this proliferation of patterns, it's transmission through noisy channels. Whatever that noisy channel is, that gives us the variance we need, and so now we just need the selection piece, right? And so basically I think that selection is also included in the first one, right? So because the replicators have variations. Some of them are going to proliferate more quickly than others. And because of that, however you want to translate from that to growth rates or to fitness, some of them are going to be more prevalent in future generations than in the previous one by virtue of the fact that they have differences. So I think self-replication is really the key idea, and these other ones kind of come along for free. But nevertheless, I'm still going to use a fitness landscape. One, just to keep connections to the way people normally model these things, and two, because I don't want to attempt to correctly model the growth rates in these scenarios. So for me, a fitness landscape is going to be just analogous to a potential in physics, except typically we try to maximize it rather than to minimize it. And then a key idea of evolutionary game theory is that the replicators themselves are part of the fitness landscape, right? So what other replicators are doing is going to affect how I behave. Okay, and then so throughout the talk, I'm going to stick to to fitness landscapes of the form where it's a matrix times a population variable. I'll give you several examples, but this is a pretty common restriction. So what is the replicator equation, right? So we want to come up with some kind of model of these replicating entities. So let's just assume we have a population of replicating types. Who knows what they are? They might have different eye colors. They might have different genotypes. They might be different species. It's really not important for the modeling. And then, so we have just some number of types, and then we have the proportions of those types in the population. And this forms a discrete probability distribution. And then we'll also assume that we have some kind of fitness landscape that attaches a value of fitness to each of the replicating organisms, each of the types of replicators. Right, and then so the heuristic motivation of the replicator equation is that the relative rate of change of the proportions of the ith type of replicators is equal to the fitness of that type minus the mean fitness of the whole population. So the idea is if my type's fitness is higher than the mean fitness, then I expect there to be more of them in subsequent generations and less. And so you just write the relative rate of change equals the fitness minus the mean fitness, right? And then so people normally write the xi on the right-hand side because, of course, it could be 0. There's also a discrete time model rather than a differential equation. And in this case, you're not using a differential equation, so you're moving from one population state to the next. And so they have to sum up to 1 instead of summing up to 0 like the derivatives do. So in this case, you end up dividing by the mean fitness instead of subtracting the mean fitness. But you can take a limit of this and basically get back the continuous one. And I just want to mention too, so I think on Monday it was mentioned that there's a nice analogy between the discrete replicator equation and Bayesian inference, and that was attributed to me, but I believe it really was first discovered by Cosmin Shalizi at CMU. So anyway, the idea here is that when you're doing inference, you have your hypotheses are kind of like your types, and then you're getting some evidence that you want to evaluate the hypothesis of. On the replicator side, you have your population states, and then your fitness landscape is sort of telling you if you're good. So you're placing your bets on your progeny, and then the fitness landscape is telling you if you make good bets or not. Yeah? Yeah, on the left, the prime is not a derivative on the left-hand side. I mean, technically, it's like a difference quotient, I guess, if you want to. Yeah. It's the next state in the process. So I start with the x sub i's, and then I multiply. I do the fitness proportion selection, and then I get a new population state. Now, I agree that in practice, we can't really write the probability distribution of the x sub i's in the same way that you would do it over here. Here, you would usually have the probability of the hypotheses in terms of, a normal distribution or whatever. That is essentially the idea. We'll get there. The I, so there's n types in the population, so I is the index over the different types in the population. So you could write it as a vector equation, but it looks better in this form. Okay, so I know some of you are probably not familiar with the replicator equation, so let's just look at some of the trajectories, some of the phase plots of it. If there's 2 types, there's really only 3 things that happen. It just depends on where the stable state is. Either it's on the boundary, either there's an unstable equilibrium in the middle, or there's a stable equilibrium in the middle. And okay, it might be moved over a little, but you can view them all sort of as isomorphic transformations of these same ones. And then you could have a trivial one where there's no motion whatsoever. And then in 3 dimensions where you have 3 types, the base space kind of explodes. So there's actually a classification in this case, and there's 48 or 46 distinct phase plots. But here you can see, oftentimes we have this interior state that we're converging into. And then I don't think it's known beyond that how many there are. And so here's an example I'm going to come back to again. This one is this particular fitness landscape. It has an interior equilibrium. It has semi-stable equilibriums on the boundary, and it has unstable equilibriums on the edge. Okay, so John mentioned in his talk this idea of evolutionary stability. There's this definition of evolutionary stability. I guess I use the word dominant. Dominant, yeah. So rather than sort of explain, there's a lot of ways that this idea comes in from either the game theory side or you can think of it as an uninvadable population state, or it's a better reply to itself than anything neighboring. But I think what's interesting is if you take the KL divergence and you put the stable state in the first position, take the derivative, it reduces to exactly the quantity that people had previously come up with as the evolutionarily stable state. And so what this means is that on trajectory, if you have this interior stable point, then you're decreasing this quantity along trajectories towards this minima. And so this is what John sort of said, that the population is in some sense learning more over time and converging to this stable state. Right, and so then an analogy with what Chris was talking about, that would sort of be the true distribution of, in a Bayesian inference analogy. Okay, and then the origin of this theorem is a little hard to prove to pin down because people didn't know about the KL divergence way back when, so there's a lot of different alternate forms, but I think the earliest reference in the literature I could find was Hofbauer in '78, and then people talked about the cross entropy, and then finally later people started using the KL divergence. So that's sort of one way to view the replicator equation information theoretically. There's another interesting way to look at it using something called information geometry. And the idea is we want to express the replicator equation as a gradient of some potential. And this is sort of known as Kimora's maximal principle. Since most of you probably aren't familiar with Riemannian geometry, the idea is we can change the geometry of a space by changing the dot product of vectors on that space. So normally if we have 2 vectors, we can use that to calculate the angle between them. In Riemannian geometry, what we're going to do is change the dot product, but keep the right-hand side the same so that we can still measure angles between vectors, but do it on, say, the surface of a sphere rather than in a plane. So what we do is we introduce something called a metric. And we put that in the middle of the dot product. And that changes the left-hand side of that equation. And then when we solve for the angle, when we invert the cosine, we'll get a different angle than we would if we hadn't done that. So for Euclidean space, the metric is just the identity matrix, so we don't worry about it normally. But it turns out in the field of information geometry, there's a special metric called the Fisher information metric. And for the simplex, the set of all discrete probability distributions, you get this funny metric where you weight the dot product by dividing by the ith population proportion. And so you get this kind of unusual dot product where at a point x, and you've got 2 vectors at the point x, you're weighting them inversely by the population proportions at those points. So the first time I saw this, it seemed terribly unintuitive to me, and it's sort of what started me on this journey to understand where it came from in the first place. So in the evolutionary game theory literature, they just give it to you, and it's called the Shoshakhani metric, and there's sort of no indication of where it came from. Just, hey, it works, so like, use it. And it's not until that Amari paper in '95, I think, that anyone made the connection between the 2 fields. But so we'll get back to that in a second. I just want to help you try and understand it. What you can do is you can take the simplex and you can apply a pretty simple transformation to it. And what it does is it translates probability distributions into circles, basically, or in spheres. So in the 3-type case, right, you have a simplex, and if you think of holding one of them constant, then that's going to translate to a circular arc here, right? And then that turns the metric on the left-hand side, it becomes just the Riemannian metric on the right-hand side. So if you would think of a geodesic in this space, the shortest path between 2 points would be, you would draw a great circle between them, and that would be the arc between them. So it's kind of an unusual one, but you can think of it as being the geometry of a sphere, if that helps.
1 over x, no? So when this probabilities become small, your distances become really large.
That's right. It's weird. So it doesn't. It's not defined on the boundary. Yeah, I know. It's odd. Okay, so the replicator equation has this feature. It's called forward invariance. That if you start in the interior of the simplex, then you stay in the interior of the simplex. So if you're not on the boundary to begin with, it doesn't matter. If you were on the boundary, you would just one of the indices would be 0, and you would just restrict to the lower simplex
So
in the first
basically
place.
it's infinite distance to the boundary.
Yeah,
Versus
it takes infinite time. Yeah.
how is that reflected on the sphere?
Well, it's the same thing that you just technically it's not defined on the boundary of the sphere.
It's finite distance to the boundary.
It's only part of it. Yeah.
It's a finite distance to the boundary. But I don't want to go in.
Okay, well, we can talk about it later. Okay, so we have a different geometry, so that changes the way our angles move, and we can use that to calculate a gradient on this curved space rather than on the flat space. And so in evolutionary game theory, it's called the Shashahani geometry. Was around 1979, there was a paper where this geometry was introduced. So I want to make this statement a little bit more precise. So if our fitness landscape is Euclidean gradient, then the right-hand side of the replicator equation is going to be a gradient with respect to this metric, the Shashahani metric that I just told you about. And this only works in the case where the matrix is symmetric. So you basically take the mean fitness. When you take the Euclidean derivative of the mean fitness, you get back to fitness landscape. And then in Riemannian geometry, there's a formula for what the gradient would look like given a metric. And it reduces to the replicator equation. So this captures this idea that we like to think about there being some kind of optimality to evolutionary processes, right? Now, this doesn't prove that it necessarily always attains the maximum mean fitness, for instance, but it does kind of capture this idea of efficiency. Okay, so some people have interpreted this as an information transport equation, much like people think of heat transport. And the two approaches are very closely related, because if you start with the KL divergence and you do a Taylor expansion, the first non-zero term, the Hessian here, is the exact same thing as the Fisher information matrix. And this is a widely studied concept in information geometry. The first one. Okay, and then you can do a lot with this. I just want to give you a quick, nice thing. So there's this concept, Fisher's fundamental theorem, that the mean fitness is non-decreasing. You get that falling out very naturally in this scenario. So rather than take the gradient, we can take the time derivative. And it's very easy to show that the time derivative of the mean fitness ends up giving you the variance of the fitness landscape. So a lot of things that are known in evolutionary theory before this, you get for free, or you get very easily in this setup. Okay, so this is a good story, and this is all based on work that done by people before me that I've just tried to put together into a somewhat coherent piece. But it turns out that these ideas are useful. You can extend them in a lot of different directions. So you can change the way that you measure information, for instance, which I think Tobias is going to talk about next. That gives you a new replicator dynamic. You get another Lyapunov theorem. You get another version of Fisher's fundamental theorem. You can also use it to study things other than the replicator equation. There's lots of so-called evolutionary dynamics besides it. Some famous ones are the Brown-von Neumann-Nash. There's one called the logit dynamic. And then you can also use this thing called timescale calculus that defines Lyapunov functions over discrete systems as well as continuous systems. And you can actually combine all these three things simultaneously to get one big theorem that covers all of these cases. And then you can also, you're not restricted to just studying this kind of thing on the simplex. So if you're interested in what happens in information geometry, they study all kinds of other manifolds. So they study, instead of discrete probability distributions, they study, say, normal distributions. And you can get a lot of these other common things, like the simplex algorithm, and you can get the EM algorithm to fall out of this framework of using a gradient over these sets of probability distributions. Okay, so in the last few minutes, yeah. I don't think there's a version of the second law, but there is in the finite population case. And so if it's something you're interested in, maybe you and Matteo and I can talk about it later. So you can get it from the fluctuation theorem in the finite population model, like a Moran model. The Shannon entropy turns out not to be interesting in this context for whatever reason. So the replicator equation, I think it's a really nice model of natural selection, of replication, but in practice, when you want to apply it, it has several very unrealistic assumptions. You're essentially assuming an infinite population size, because I need that so that I can take the derivative of the population proportions, which wouldn't be possible unless it was smooth. There's no drift because there's no induced drift due to, say, small population sizes. There's no mutation or stochasticity of any kind. That's obviously a flaw, since I sold you the idea, or I tried to, that replication is pushing through a noisy channel, right? And then the model had no actual noise in it. So that's something we need to fix. But it turns out these same ideas, though, can be used in finite population models to get similar results. And so we take something like the Moran process, which is a Markov model that is essentially the replicator equation. It's fitness proportionate selection. And you can add in mutation to that. And so you no longer have deterministic trajectories like you did before, so you certainly can't say that you're converging to, say, an evolutionarily stable state. But what you can do is look at the long-run outcomes of the process, the stationary distribution of the process, and you'd like that to somehow reflect what's going on. You'd like maybe it to be concentrated on the stable points. And so you can do that, and what you do is you calculate the expected next state. If I'm in this state, I have transitions to all the neighboring population states. I calculate what my expected next position is, and then I'm stable if the expected next spot is where I'm already at. I don't expect to move anywhere. And so you can systematically discover these by minimizing the KL divergence between the two of them. So here's that landscape I showed you before that had the stable point in the middle and the semi-stable points on the boundaries and the unstable points. This is a replicator phase plot, and here's the vector field for that same equation. With a finite population model, you've discretized the simplex, and the color indicates the size of the stationary distribution. So the long-run outcomes of running the Markov process. And what we see is we've got a local max here where we've got the stable point in the center. We've got local maxes at the semi-stable points, and we've got local minima at the unstable points. And then if you look at the KL divergence computed from any state in the neighboring state, it's minimal at these stable points and at the boundary points. So this is really nice because stationary distribution is difficult to calculate. There's no systematic way of calculating it in general, whereas this is very, very easy to calculate and allows us to use the same ideas as before. So that's it.